Admiral Chester William Nimitz stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the Pacific horizon through his binoculars as dawn broke on June 3, 1942. The weight of an entire war pressed upon his shoulders, and he knew that within days, perhaps hours, the fate of the Pacific would be decided in the waters surrounding a small atoll called Midway. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the American Navy was about to face its greatest test. The Japanese combined fleet, under the command of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was steaming toward Midway with overwhelming force. For aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu formed the heart of the WWII, the same carrier strike force that had devastated Pearl Harbor. Supporting them were battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and invasion transports carrying over 5,000 troops. Yamamoto's plan was audacious: lure the remaining American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle and destroy it completely, opening the path to Hawaii and forcing the United States to negotiate peace. What Yamamoto didn't know was that American codebreakers at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had cracked the Japanese naval code JN-25. Commander Joseph John Rockford and his team had been working around the clock, piecing together intercepted messages that revealed not just the target Midway, but the timing and composition of the Japanese fleet. This intelligence breakthrough, as reported in declassified Navy documents from the National Archives, would prove to be one of the most significant advantages in naval history. Nimitz had gathered every available ship for the defense of Midway. Task Force 16, under Rear Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance, included the carriers Enterprise and Hornet. Task Force 17, commanded by Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, centered around the hastily repaired Yorktown, which had limped back to Pearl Harbor after the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks before. In total, the Americans could muster 3 carriers, 8 cruisers, and 15 destroyers, a force significantly outnumbered by the approaching Japanese armada. On Midway itself, the tiny atoll buzzed with desperate preparation. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Henry Shannon commanded the 6th Marine Defense Battalion, while Lieutenant Colonel Ira Lafayette Kimes led the ground forces. They had fewer than 3,000 men to defend an island barely 6 miles long. The runways were crowded with every available aircraft: obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters, Douglas Dauntless dive bombers, and a handful of new Grumman Wildcat fighters. The stage was set for what historians would later call the most decisive naval battle of the Pacific War. As the sun climbed higher on that June morning, both fleets moved inexorably toward their destiny. The American defenders knew they were outnumbered and outgunned, but they possessed something the Japanese fleet lacked: complete knowledge of their enemy's plans and the desperate determination of men fighting with their backs to the wall. In the ready rooms aboard the American carriers, pilots received their final briefings. Many were young men barely out of flight school, thrust into a battle that would determine whether democracy or militarism would dominate the Pacific. As they prepared their aircraft for what might be their final mission, none could have imagined that their actions in the coming days would mark the beginning of the end for the Japanese Empire's expansion across the Pacific. At 4:30 in the morning on June 4, 1942, the first Nakajima reconnaissance seaplane lifted off from the cruiser Tome, its engine echoing across the dark Pacific waters. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the WWII from the bridge of Akagi, watched as his search planes disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness. The same man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor was now preparing to deliver what he believed would be the final blow to American naval power in the Pacific. Meanwhile, on Midway, radar operator Private Joseph Lester McDonald watched his scope intently in the dimly lit Operations Bunker. At 5:25, he saw what he had been dreading: a massive formation of aircraft approaching from the northwest. Many planes bearing 320, distance 150, he reported, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was seeing. The first wave of Japanese attackers, 108 aircraft led by Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, was 30 minutes away from Midway. The Marine pilots scrambled to meet them. Major Floyd Becker Parks led the 21st Fighter Squadron into the sky, their obsolete Brewster Buffaloes climbing desperately toward the incoming Japanese formation. They knew their aircraft were outclassed by the Mitsubishi Zero fighters, escorting the Japanese bombers, but they also knew that every enemy plane that could stop men lives safe on the ground below. The air battle that followed was a massacre. The Japanese Zeros, flown by veteran pilots with years of combat experience, tore through the Marine formation. Parks himself was shot down and killed, along with 14 of his 25 pilots. Yet their sacrifice was not in vain. They had disrupted the Japanese formation and forced them to fight, reducing the effectiveness of the bombing attack that followed. At 6:20, the Japanese bombers reached Midway. Lieutenant Tominaga led his Nakajima Cape bombers in a devastating attack on the airfield installations, while Aichi Valdai bombers targeted the fuel storage areas and defensive positions. The island shook under the impact of explosions as hangars burst into flames and fuel dumps erupted in towering pillars of smoke and fire. Marine Corporal Harold William Thompson, manning an anti-aircraft gun, watched in horror as the commanding officer's quarters took a direct hit, but continued firing his weapon until a bomb fragment knocked him unconscious. Despite the ferocity of the attack, Midway's defenses held. The runways, though cratered, remained operational. More importantly, the Japanese had failed to achieve their primary objective, the complete destruction of Midway's ability to launch aircraft. As Tominaga surveyed the damage from his bomber, he radioed back to Admiral Nagumo, "There is need for a second attack wave." This message would prove to be one of the most faithful communications in naval history. Aboard Akagi, Nagumo faced a critical decision. His second wave of aircraft was already armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for attacking ships the American fleet, his reconnaissance planes, were supposedly searching for. To launch a second attack on Midway, he would need to bring these aircraft below decks, remove the anti-ship weapons, and rearm them with high-explosive bombs suitable for attacking land targets. As deck crews began the laborious process of rearming 93 aircraft, time was running out. Unknown to Nagumo, American dive bombers were already in the air, launched from the Enterprise, Hornet, at Yorktown while his attention was focused on Midway. The Japanese admiral had made his choice, but it would cost him precious minutes that he could not afford to lose. The fate of carriers and the course of the Pacific War now hung in the balance, as hundreds of aircraft converged on a patch of ocean that would soon become the graveyard of the Japanese Navy's elite carrier force. At 7:15 on the morning of June 4th, the delayed reconnaissance seaplane from the cruiser Tone finally reached its assigned search area. Petty Officer First Class Amari Takeshi, scanning the ocean through his binoculars, suddenly froze. Below him, steaming at high speed toward the Japanese fleet, were the unmistakable wakes of American warships. His radio crackled to life. "Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships, in position bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway." Admiral Nagumo's heart sank as he received the report. The American fleet, the very target of Operation Me, was not only present, but positioned to attack his carriers. Worse still, his second wave aircraft were still below decks being rearmed for the second Midway strike. The bombs and torpedoes needed to attack ships lay stacked on the hangar decks, while his planes carried land attack ordnance. Commander Minoru Genda, Nagumo's air operations officer and architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, immediately grasped the implications. They were caught in the worst possible tactical situation. The rearming process ground to a halt as frantic deck crews began the complex task of switching weapons again. Aviation ordnance men sweated in the tropical heat as they manhandled heavy torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, racing against time while trying not to make fatal mistakes with the volatile explosives. Captain Jisaku Okada of the Kaga watched nervously as bombs and torpedoes were stacked carelessly. On the hangar deck, proper procedure would have required them to be returned to the magazines. But there was no time. Meanwhile, the first American attack was already inbound. Lieutenant Colonel Walter Carl Sweeney Jr. led 16 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses from Midway in a high-altitude bombing attack on the Japanese carriers. From 20,000 feet, the massive bombers released their payloads on the weaving carriers below. The Japanese ships twisted and turned at flank speed, their wakes drawing wide scars across the blue Pacific as they avoided the falling bombs. Not a single hit was scored, but the attack further delayed the Japanese rearming operation and kept Nagumo's fighters busy. At 8:10, disaster struck Task Force 16's air group. The Hornet squadrons, led by Commander Stanhope Cotton Rain, had become separated in the cloudy weather and were flying on the wrong heading. Ring's decision to continue northeast while the Japanese fleet had turned north would go down as one of the most controversial navigation errors of the war. Torpedo Squadron 8, led by Lieutenant Commander John Charles Waldron, broke away from the formation. Waldron, a veteran pilot with Native American heritage, had studied Japanese naval tactics intensively and trusted his instincts over his orders. Waldron's intuition proved correct. At night, his 15 Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers found the Japanese fleet. What followed was an act of pure courage that bordered on suicide. The obsolete Devastators, flying barely 50 feet above the waves at 90 knots, We're sitting ducks for the Japanese Zeros diving down from above. Waldron's voice crackled over the radio one final time. We were going. We won't turn back. Good luck, everybody. One by one, the torpedo bombers were shot down. Ensign George Holden Gay Jr. watched in horror as his squadron mates crashed into the Pacific around him. When his own aircraft was hit and began smoking, he continued his attack run until the last possible moment before crash landing in the ocean. He would be the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, floating in his life jacket and watching the battle unfold from the water. Similar fates awaited the torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Elbert Lindsay led Torpedo Squadron 6 into the same deadly crossfire, losing 10 of 14 aircraft. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Lance Edward Massey, suffered 12 losses out of 13 planes. In less than an hour, American torpedo aviation had been virtually annihilated. Yet their sacrifice served a crucial purpose. The low-flying torpedo attacks had drawn every Japanese fighter down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches completely undefended. As the last Devastator crashed into the Pacific, the Japanese combat air patrol was out of position, low on fuel and ammunition. High above, undetected and unopposed, the American dive bombers were beginning their final approach. At 10:22 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey Jr. pushed his Douglas Dauntless dive bomber into a steep dive toward the Japanese carrier Kaga. 2 miles below, the flight deck of the great carrier was crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. Their wings folded as deck crews rushed to prepare them for launch. Gasoline hoses snaked across the deck, ammunition was stacked in the open, and the ship's magazines were loaded with aviation fuel and ordnance. It was a perfect target, and McCluskey knew it. The Enterprise Air Group commander had been flying for over an hour, his fuel gauge dropping toward the critical level that would force him to turn back. His original search pattern had found empty ocean where the Japanese fleet should have been. Then, at 10:05, he spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northward at high speed to Arashi, returning to the main fleet after depth-charging the submarine Nautilus. McCluskey made the decision that would change naval history. He would follow the destroyer's wake. Behind McCluskey, 36 Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown screamed down through the clear Pacific sky. The pilots had trained for this moment for months, practicing their dives over the California coast and the Hawaiian Islands. Now, with Japanese Zero fighters circling helplessly at sea level where they had been drawn by the torpedo attacks, the dive bombers had achieved complete surprise. Lieutenant Richard Halsey Best, leading the 2nd Division of Bombing Squadron 6, selected the carrier Akagi as his target. The flagship of the WWII presented an inviting target, her flight deck packed with aircraft and her island superstructure bristling with radio antennas. As Best pushed over into his dive, he could see Admiral Nagumo's battle flag flying from the carrier's mast. One well-placed bomb could decapitate the entire Japanese operation. The first bombs began falling at 10-20-6. Lieutenant Edwin John Kroger's 1,000-pound bomb struck Kagan near her island superstructure, penetrating to the upper hangar deck before exploding among the rearmed aircraft waiting there. The blast ignited aviation fuel and touched off secondary explosions as bombs and torpedoes cooked off in the inferno. Within minutes, the great carrier was transformed from a proud warship into a blazing tomb. Akagi suffered a similar fate. Best's bomb struck just behind the carrier's island, penetrating to the hangar deck where it detonated among aircraft loaded with fuel and ammunition. The blast lifted the forward elevator completely off its mounts, and fires began racing through the ship's vital spaces. Captain Taijiro Aoki watched in horror as his flagship began dying around him. The proud vessel that had carried the rising sun across the Pacific now consumed by flames. Meanwhile, Yorktown's dive bombers had found the carrier Soryu. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Franklin Leslie led his squadron in a textbook attack, and 3 direct hits turned the carrier into an inferno within minutes. Commander Ryusaku Yanagimoto, Soryu's captain, chose to go down with his ship, lashing himself to the bridge as the carrier rolled over and sank. The transformation was stunning in its speed and completeness. In 5 minutes from 10:24 to 10-20-9-3 of Japan's fleet carriers had been mortally wounded. These were not just ships, they were the cream of Japanese naval aviation, carrying veteran pilots who had honed their skills in China and perfected their techniques at Pearl Harbor. The air crews burning in the hangar decks represented years of training that could never be replaced. Admiral Nagumo, standing on Akagi's bridge as his flagship burned around him, could hardly comprehend the magnitude of the disaster. The same man who had achieved the greatest naval surprise attack in history had now suffered an equally stunning reversal. As damage control parties fought desperately against the spreading fires, Nagumo was forced to transfer his flag to the cruiser Nagara, watching helplessly as his carrier slipped beneath the Pacific waves. Yet the battle was far from over. One Japanese carrier remained Hiryu, under the command of Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, the most aggressive of Japan's carrier commanders. Yamaguchi was already preparing a counterstrike that would remind the Americans that the Imperial Japanese Navy was not yet defeated. As the smoke from 3 burning carriers darkened the Pacific sky, both fleets prepared for the next round of what was becoming the most decisive naval battle since Trafalgar. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of Hiryu, the last surviving Japanese carrier, and surveyed the catastrophe that had befallen the Kido Butai. 3 carriers were burning on the horizon: Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, their smoke cones rising like funeral pyres against the afternoon sky. Yet Yamaguchi, known throughout the Imperial Japanese Navy for his aggressive spirit and tactical brilliance, was not ready to concede defeat. If Hiryu was to die, she would die fighting. At 11:05, Yamaguchi launched his first counterstrike, 18 Aichi Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters, under Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. Their target was the American carrier force, which Japanese reconnaissance had finally located. The strike force climbed into the Pacific sky, carrying the hopes of a dying fleet and the honor of the rising sun. These pilots knew they were likely flying to their deaths, but they also knew that Bushido, the way of the warrior, demanded nothing less than their complete commitment. Meanwhile, aboard the American carriers, damage control crews worked frantically to repair the morning's battle damage and prepare for the inevitable counterattack. The Yorktown, already wounded from the Battle of the Coral Sea, had taken on a slight list that Captain Elliot Buckmaster's crew was struggling to correct. Her radar operators, led by Chief Petty Officer Oscar Washington Peterson, scanned the skies nervously for incoming bogeys. At 12:05, Peterson's worst fears materialized. Large formation of aircraft bearing 032, distance 46 miles. He reported over the ship's communication system. The Japanese were coming, and they were coming hard. Yorktown's fighter director officer, Lieutenant Commander Oscar Pedersen, scrambled every available Grumman Wildcat fighter to intercept the incoming strike. The air battle that followed was fierce and desperate. Lieutenant Commander John Smith Thatch, leading Fighting Squadron 3, employed the revolutionary Thatch-weave defensive maneuver he had developed to counter the superior maneuverability of Japanese Zero fighters. As his Wildcats wove back and forth in mutual support, they managed to shoot down several of the attacking dive bombers, but could not stop them all. Lieutenant Kobayashi led his remaining bombers through the defensive screen and began their attack on Yorktown. The first bomb struck near the ship's island superstructure, penetrating deep into the vessel before exploding among the boiler uptakes. The blast killed or wounded dozens of men and knocked out several boilers, reducing the carrier's speed to just 6 knots. A second bomb struck near the forward elevator, starting fires that threatened the ship's aviation fuel storage. Captain Buckmaster's damage control organization went to work with legendary efficiency. Chief Warrant Officer Charles Kleinsmith led teams into smoke-filled compartments to shore up damaged bulkheads, while aviation machinists made First-Class Irving Herbert Schindler organized firefighting efforts on the hangar deck. Within an hour, they had not only stopped the fires, but restored the ship's power and gotten her underway at 20 knots, a feat of seamanship that amazed even experienced naval officers. But Yamaguchi was not finished. At 2:30, he launched his second and final strike, 10K torpedo bombers and 6 Zero fighters led by Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, the same pilot who had led the morning attack on Midway. Tomonaga's own aircraft had been damaged in that earlier mission, its fuel tank holed by defensive fire. But he insisted on leading this crucial attack despite knowing he lacked the fuel for a return trip. This time, the Japanese struck with devastating precision. Despite a heroic defense by Yorktown's combat air patrol, the torpedoes struck the carrier's port side. The explosions knocked out power throughout the ship and caused a severe list that made flight operations impossible. Water poured through the gaping holes in her hull as her engineering spaces began flooding. As Yorktown's crew fought to save their ship, Captain Buckmaster made the heartbreaking decision to abandon her. All hands abandoned ship came the order over the public address system. Sailors helped wounded shipmates over the side as the great carrier slowly settled by the head. Yet even as his flagship died beneath him, Admiral Fletcher had already transferred operational command to Admiral Spruance aboard Enterprise. The American fleet would fight on, but they had paid a better price for their morning victory. The Pacific War's most crucial battle was entering its final, decisive phase. As the afternoon sun climbed toward its zenith on June 4, 1942, the balance of the battle hung in precarious equilibrium. The Japanese had lost 3 fleet carriers, but had struck back savagely at Yorktown, which now lay dead in the water, her crew abandoning ship as she slowly settled by the head. Admiral Yamaguchi aboard Hiryu believed he had evened the odds 3 Japanese carriers for 1 American. He was preparing another strike when scout planes brought devastating news. The Americans had not won, but the undamaged carrier still operational, Admiral Raymond Spruance, now commanding the American task force from Enterprise, wasted no time in exploiting his intelligence advantage. The intercepted Japanese communications had revealed Hiryu's position, and Spruance immediately began preparing to strike to eliminate the last Japanese carrier. At 3:03, Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led 24 Dauntless dive bombers into the sky, followed by Fighting Squadron 6 under Lieutenant Albert Ogden Vorse Jr. to provide escort. The American pilots flew through towering cumulus clouds, using them for concealment as they approached the Japanese formation. Below them, Hiryu steamed in a box formation with her escorts to battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The carrier herself appeared undamaged, her flight deck clear and ready to launch another strike. It was a tempting target, but the American pilots knew they would get only one chance. At 5:05, Gallagher pushed over into his attack dive from 14,000 feet. The Dauntless duffed through increasingly heavy anti-aircraft fire as every gun in the Japanese formation opened up. Tracer rounds streaked past the diving bombers like deadly fireworks, and black bursts of anti-aircraft shells filled the sky around them. Several aircraft were hit, but the American formation held together as they plummeted toward their target. The first bomb, dropped by Ensign Frederick Thomas Weber, was a near miss that showered Hiryu's flight deck with fragments and splinters. But the second bomb, delivered by Lieutenant Commander Richard Eugene Fleming's aircraft, struck home with devastating effect. Within minutes, Hiryu was transformed from a fighting ship into a blazing inferno. Captain Tomio Kaku watched helplessly as fire spread throughout his carrier, consuming aircraft, fuel, and the lives of hundreds of his crew. In the engine spaces below, Chief Engineer Commander Kunizo Kato and his men fought desperately to maintain power as the ship's vital systems began failing one by one. Admiral Yamaguchi, realizing that his flagship was doomed, made the decision to go down with his ship. As the senior carrier division commander present, he felt personally responsible for the disaster that had befallen the Kido Butai. Standing on Hiryu's bridge with Captain Kaku, both men composed final messages to their families and to Emperor Hirohito, accepting full responsibility for the defeat and asking forgiveness for their failure. By midnight, all 4 Japanese carriers were gone. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu had sunk during the afternoon, taking with them over 1,000 officers and men. Hiryu, the last to die, finally slipped beneath the Pacific waves at 9:05 the following morning, after her surviving crew had been evacuated to escorting destroyers. With them went the veteran pilots and aircrew, who represented the heart of Japanese naval aviation, irreplaceable men, whose loss would cripple Japan's carrier operations for the remainder of the war. Admiral Yamamoto, receiving reports of the disaster from his flagship Yamato 300 miles to the west, initially refused to believe the magnitude of the catastrophe. When the truth finally became undeniable, the architect of Pearl Harbor contemplated bringing his battleships forward to engage the American fleet in a surface action. But with his air cover gone and American submarines prowling the area, discretion proved the better part of valor. At 3:15 in the morning on June 5th, Yamamoto issued the order that marked the end of Japanese offensive operations in the Pacific. Operation Me is canceled. All forces will withdraw. The Battle of Midway was effectively over, though scattered fighting would continue for another day. In 6 hours of combat, the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted decisively. Japan's finest carriers lay on the ocean floor, along with the cream of her naval aviation. The Rising Sun, which had seemed destined to dominate the Pacific, had suffered a defeat from which it would never recover. On the morning of June 7, 1942, Admiral Chester Nimitz stood once again on the bridge of his flagship, but this time the weight on his shoulders felt different. The intercepted radio traffic told the story. Admiral Yamamoto's combined fleet was in full retreat, streaming back toward Japan. with the remnants of what had once been the most powerful naval striking force in the world. The gamble had paid off, but at a terrible cost that was only beginning to be calculated. The human toll of the battle was staggering. Japan had lost approximately 3,500 men, including many of her most experienced pilots and aircrew. Captain Jisaku Okada of Kaga, Commander Ryusaku Yanagimoto of Soryu, Admiral Yamaguchi, and Captain Kaku of Hiryu had chosen to go down with their ships in accordance with the ancient code of Bushido. Their deaths robbed the Imperial Navy of some of its finest officers, men whose experience and tactical knowledge could never be replaced. American losses, while significantly lighter, were nonetheless painful. The gallant torpedo bomber squadrons had been virtually wiped out, 35 of 41 aircraft lost, with crews like Lieutenant Commander John Waldron and his entire Torpedo Squadron 8 becoming legends of sacrifice and courage. Yorktown, the veteran carrier that had fought at Coral Sea and limped back to Pearl Harbor for hasty repairs, had finally succumbed to her wounds and Japanese torpedoes, sinking with the destroyer Hammond on June 6. Yet the strategic implications of the victory far outweighed the tactical losses, according to wartime records from the Office of Naval Intelligence, later released by the National Security Archive. The Japanese Navy had lost not just for carriers, but the trained pilots and support personnel who made carrier operations possible. It would take Japan nearly 2 years to replace the aircraft lost at Midway, and the experienced aircrews could never be replaced at all. The battle marked the end of Japanese expansion across the Pacific. The planned invasion of Midway was abandoned, and with it any realistic hope of threatening Hawaii or the American West Coast. More importantly, the aura of Japanese invincibility that had dominated the Pacific since Pearl Harbor was shattered forever. American morale, which had suffered through 6 months of unbroken defeats, suddenly soared as news of the victory spread across the nation. Captain Richard Fleming, whose bomb had helped sink Hiryu, was posthumously awarded